Live with Mel. This episode is brought to you by Yellow Cab Company of DC. If you're looking to avoid rideshare prices, then check out the Yellow Cab Company of DC when you are in the nation's capital. Trudeau has stated that the blockades are illegal, and if you're still participating, it is time to go. It looks as though Canada is taking the next steps to ensure that the Freedom Convoy leaves Canada. Now, the Freedom Convoy has been there for many weeks, and as we all know, the Freedom Convoy is essentially there to stop all of the COVID-19 mandates that are in place in Canada, but it's also spreading across the globe as well into the United States. Now, Canada has initially tried to deal with this peacefully, essentially asking the protesters to leave and then issuing tickets, citations, etc. But with the growing number of people at the border, Canada decided to take the next step. Essentially, Trudeau has invoked the Emergency Act for the first time in Canada's history in order to deal with the protesters. Canada has decided that the Freedom Convoy does essentially cause such a big issue in Canada that they're invoking a policy, an act that has never been invoked before. Canada is ready for the protesters to leave, and they're taking the necessary steps in order to ensure that Canada's borders are open again without any blockade or without any protesters or without anyone occupying the areas. Now, one of the reasons why Canada has invoked this act is because they are now worried about violence that could take place at the border. Now, what exactly is the Emergency Act? Essentially, the Emergency Act gives the government a large amount of rights for the next 30 days to allow them to get rid of the protesters. Now, while this act does give them sweeping rights across the board, Trudeau is still saying that he does not want to use military force, but instead he wants to allow the police the ability to deal with the situation. Now, they're still giving tickets, they're still giving citations, they're still seizing vehicles, they're still towing vehicles, and they're still seizing fuel. Now, one of the things that they also want to do is to ensure that the money being raised for the Freedom Convoy never gets to the hands of the people in the convoy. They're trying to shut them down financially, because if they don't have the money to continue the convoy, then they won't be able to do it. Now, the Emergencies Act does give the government the ability to freeze the accounts of the people in charge of the organizers. And as we know, they've been raising millions and millions of dollars in order to fund this Freedom Convoy. Initially, they were using GoFundMe, which refunded everyone back their money. But then they switched to other crowd fundraising organizations to raise the money. Now, while the government can't necessarily stop them from raising the money, they can stop the money from getting into the accounts of the organizers, and they can freeze their accounts, which they are now trying to do. Now, the Emergency Act was passed in 1988, and it has never been used before. Now, there are four possibilities why the government can use these acts: in the presence of sabotage, in the presence of foreign influence activities, threats or use of serious violence for political, religious, or ideological objectives, or convert unlawful acts intended to undermine or overthrow the constitutionally established government. Now, because of these reasons, they can use the Emergency Act. Now, for the Freedom Convoy, for this protest, for this occupation, because again, at this point, the Freedom Convoy has stepped past the lines of protest, and they're essentially occupying the space in Canada. Now, the threats of violence is one reason why they could have used to invoke the Emergency Act, and also foreign influence. Now, when we look at the money that is being donated to the Freedom Convoy, it is being said that about 40% of the money being donated is actually coming from the United States. It seems as though Americans are funding a big portion of the Freedom Convoy, with the rest of the money primarily being donated by Canadians. But 40% of international money is coming in, and that is coming from the states. And even Republican candidates, Republican politicians are even encouraging and supporting the Freedom Convoy in Canada. So again, that could be seen as foreign influences. Now, the threat of violence is also something that could have been that push that essentially allowed them to invoke the Emergency Act, because violence did start to happen. Now, for the most part, in the Freedom Convoy, it has been mostly peaceful, but there have been some few bad actors that have caused problems in the city. However, over the past couple of days, there was a big turn. And the Canadian government essentially saw that it could start to get violent, and not just slightly violent, but extremely, extremely violent. Now, if we go outside of Ottawa and we go to Alberta, that's where we see where the violence could have happened. And they're saying that there is a group within the larger group that had more of a militia mindset, and that they were planning to get violent if any type of government police tried to stop the convoy. Now, a few hours prior to Trudeau announcing the Emergency Act, the Canadian police in Alberta had to issue search warrants because they heard rumors, they had intel that people were bringing guns across the border. And sure enough, they found guns. Now, again, hours before the Emergency Act was invoked, they had seized a truck full of guns. There was a group, and again, this is from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Alberta. This is what they said. The group was said to have a willingness to use force against the police if any attempts were made to disrupt the blockade. Once they issued the search warrant and the RCMP came in, they found 13 long guns, handguns, multiple sets of body armor, a machete, a large quantity of ammunition, and high-capacity magazines. It looks as though, with what happened here in Alberta, that they were planning to use violence if the police tried to stop them. Now, again, the majority of the protests of the occupation of the Freedom Convoy had been peaceful. But it looks as though Canada is invoking the Emergency Act because it looks as though the mentality of a small group in the crowd was changing from being a peaceful protest to that of violence, especially with the amount of guns, armor, ammunition, high-capacity magazines that they found in Alberta. So with these people, they essentially arrested 11 individuals in connection with them bringing the guns in across the border and having the guns there, and them being prepared to use the guns and ammunitions against the police if the police did try to break it up. Now, that was not the only threats of violence against the Canadian police in Alberta. Officers also arrested 2 other individuals because they turned their vehicles into a weapon. So on the northbound side, a semi-truck approached the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they tried to essentially hit the police with their vehicles. They started accelerating towards the vehicles, towards the police, and at the last minute swerved. but they were attempting to hit the police with their vehicle, essentially turning their vehicle into a weapon. Now, altogether in Alberta, 13 people were arrested for the two separate incidents. And again, that was in the span of 24 hours. So it does seem as though the mentality of the protests in Alberta was switching from a protest that was supposed to be conducted peacefully to that where violence could erupt. And again, these incidents happened just a few hours before Trudeau announced that he was invoking the Emergency Act. And we can see how this threat of violence and attempted violence could have pushed the Canadian government to invoke the Emergency Acts. With them finding those trucks filled with weapons, filled with ammunition, filled with body armor, and with trucks actively trying to use their vehicles as a weapon to hit the police, Canada, Trudeau, and the Canadian government could see that this protest was going in a completely different direction. Now, again, because of the attempted violence and because of the seizure of weapons, the larger group in Alberta is now planning to leave. With the call of the Emergency Act and everything that's happening, the group in Alberta is now leaving. They're making plans, they're making preparations to leave, but it still leaves the other parts of the Freedom Convoy, especially in Ottawa, still there, still trying to essentially protest against the COVID mandates. But again, we do see, and again, it's not the whole group. I do want to make sure I put that out there, that it's not the whole group, but we are seeing that certain members within the group are shifting from peaceful protest to militia mindset. And it is seen with that, with those arrests and with the weapons that were seized at the border. Now, again, the Emergency Act is going to give Trudeau and the Canadian government and the police the ability to deal with the situation in a sweeping fashion. The Emergency Act has been invoked by Trudeau, and like I stated before, this has been the first time in the country's history since this act was created back in 1988, the first time that the government is using it. And again, the reasons that they can call it, there are 4 reasons why the government can invoke this act. It's sabotage, espionage, foreign influence activities, threats of use of serious violence for political, religious, or ideological objectives, or covert unlawful acts intended to undermine or overthrow the constitutionally established government. So the threats or act of violence is there, and then the foreign influence activity is there as well. And the Canadian government could have used these 2 reasons to say why they would like to use or invoke the Emergency Acts. Now, again, after the guns were seized, after the 13 arrests were made, after the 2 truck drivers turned their trucks into a weapon, the crowd in Alberta is starting to leave. But whilst there are some people who are saying it's time to pack up because the mentality of the group is changing, we are seeing that there are still people who are part of the Freedom Convoy who are going to stick it out to the very end. But let's go ahead and go to the comments. Joanna says, hopefully by placing the Emergency Act doesn't make things worse. And I do think it's the opposite. I think they invoked the Emergency Act because things were getting worse. Again, many people do think that by invoking the Emergency Act, things may possibly get worse, but I don't think that is the cause. I think the Emergency Act is going to give the government the ability to deal with it if it does get worse. Because again, the guns, the ammunition, the body armor were all seized prior to the announcement of this Emergency Act. They were all taken away prior to this, which means that the crowd, that the people who were there at the Freedom Convoy, who do have that militia mindset, were already prepared to use these weapons prior to the Emergency Act being invoked. I do think that Canada is doing the right thing by invoking the Emergency Act, especially with the new information that's coming out. It started peaceful. They overstayed their welcome. I do think it went past a protest, and now we're seeing an occupation of an area. They're completely shutting down many borders, and the government does have to deal with it. But with weapons being seized, with truckers using their truck as a weapon and driving towards the police in an attempt to injure or possibly kill the police, it's already turning violent. And this was prior to the Emergency Act. So I think the Emergency Act was put in place to stop it from actually getting to that part. Now, the next part is the money. And I know we spoke about the money a little bit earlier in the broadcast. The next part of it is the actual money. They're trying to cut off the funding from the various groups who are donating. If you stop the money from getting to the protesters, they essentially will run out of resources to stay there and occupy the area. Now, again, a large portion of the money is coming from international places, primarily the United States. While the majority of the funding is coming from Canada, about 40% of the funding is coming from the United States. It's coming from the other side of the border. Let's see. Hackers who infiltrated the fundraising websites, they essentially dumped a file, and they said there was, at the time, so this was a couple days ago, 93,000 donations totaling 8.4 million altogether. And 40% of that money came from people on the other side of the border. It came from Americans. But because this Emergency Act was put in place for the next 30 days, financial institutions will now have the power to freeze the bank accounts of people who are receiving the money. They can see who essentially is receiving the money from these donations, and then they can freeze it so that money is never used in the Freedom Convoy. So Joanna says, there is so much more to this Emergency Act. Not sure if this is true. I read banks will be able to freeze personal accounts of anyone linked with the protests. And that is true. The Emergency Act does give financial institutions the ability to freeze people's accounts. It gives the Canadian government a lot of leeway to do a lot of things. Now, again, they were trying to have the protesters leave without having to bring in the military. And Trudeau is still staying true to his word by saying he does not want to get the military involved. And going ahead and cutting off their supplies, going ahead and cutting their funding will be a way to have them leave. Because like I stated earlier, if they are not funded, if they do not have the money to stay in the area, get themselves supplies, then they will have to leave. So again, their next tactic is financial. Their next tactic is to cut off any type of funding, any kind of money that could continue to fund the illegal protest. Because at this time, because the Emergency Act was invoked, they can now cut off their funding. And again, it's for good reason. With the presence of weapons, with the presence of people turning their vehicles into weapons and driving towards the police in an attempt to injure or kill the police, the Canadian government does have to step up and do something. This is no longer a peaceful protest. It may have started as a peaceful protest, and the majority of people who participated in the protest wanted to keep it a peaceful protest. That's not the direction it's going anymore. And with the seizures of the weapons, with the arrest of the truckers trying to drive into police officers, we see that the mentality is shifting. And even people who are still at the protest, because again, there's a large number of people who are now leaving. In Alberta, after the arrest, after the guns, after the attacks, or the attempted attacks, the protest in Alberta has essentially been called off. But there are still people who are staying there and said they're going to stay there and fight till the very end. One person was quoted as saying, "There are no threats that will frighten us. We will hold the line." And again, so there are some protesters whose mentalities are different than the other protesters, where they will stay, they will fight, they will try to bring in the weapons, they will try to fight the police, and they are there. So we are seeing that there is a shift in mentality, and that's one of the big reasons why the Emergency Act was essentially invoked. Now, again, there are some people saying that it should not have been invoked. There are some people who, again, are against the government using this type of power to essentially stop the protest. And then let's go ahead and go to the comments. Joanna says, "I agree. It's a very dangerous situation now, but they allowed it to go on for that far. I believe in the beginning it could have been handled a different way." I think Canada was being very Canadian with essentially the first week. They asked the protesters to leave. They said they're not changing things, and they asked them to leave. Now, again, some people were calling for the government to have negotiations with the protesters, and that is something that they could have done differently. But Trudeau and the rest of the Canadian government essentially said that they're not going to change the mandates that were put in place because they were following the science, and they weren't going to allow protesters to demand things. They were going to continue to follow the science, and when the science said it was okay to lift the mandates, that's when they will. Next came different types of states of emergency, where they essentially just tried to seize things in order to get them to leave. So Canada has been trying to get the protesters to leave in the first week. In the second week, they still would not leave. So now they're trying to use this Emergency Act to get them to leave. And again, the Canadian police, the government, have been very peaceful with dealing with the protesters. They are ready for them to leave. Canada is losing a huge amount of money because they're blocking various bridges, because they're blocking various entry points into Canada. They're freezing certain economies on border towns. The Canadian government's fed up. They want them to leave, and they're still trying to do so peacefully. Again, even though they invoked the Emergency Act, Trudeau still hasn't called the military in. Instead of calling the military, they're trying to freeze bank accounts to get them to leave. Again, they're trying to shut down their ability to get supplies instead of having the police go head-to-head with protesters. They're still trying to get the protesters to leave on their own accord by stopping supplies. The government could have went other ways, and this could have turned into something that was much more violent with much more aggression. And Canada is trying piece by piece, step by step, every option they have before they do call in the military. Because if the protesters continue to fight, I can only imagine that at some point, the military will be called in. If more people, if more protesters, if more people on the Freedom Convoy try to bring more guns in, if they try to bring in more ammunition, at a certain point, the military is going to be called. Canada's trying to do things in a way that could take longer, but could essentially keep the peace. At this point, it is up to the protesters. The government seizing vehicles, seizing fuel, trying to freeze money is a way to do this peacefully. Again, many other governments would essentially have called the military in by now. So while many people are shocked that Canada has invoked this Emergency Act, I believe Canada is doing so. I believe Trudeau is doing so because he's still trying to keep peace within the nation. He's trying to keep peace within the country. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens with the Freedom Convoy. We do know that one of the main convoys in Alberta is now breaking up, and that's because violence essentially broke out. They seized weapons, they seized machetes, they seized guns, they seized ammos, they seized armor. And they arrested 11 people for that. And then they had to arrest 2 more people because they turned their trucks into weapons and essentially drove their trucks towards police officers in an attempt to injure or kill them, and changed their mind last minute and end up crashing into something. That is not a peaceful protest. And Canada does have to do so. And I do believe that Trudeau is using a lot of restraint when it comes to dealing with the protesters. Again, he's essentially trying to smoke them out instead of sending in the military where it could cause violence. So guys, let me know what your thoughts are on the Freedom Convoy, with Trudeau essentially invoking this emergency act that has never been invoked before in all of Canadian history. So let me know what your thoughts are about everything that's going on, and I will keep you updated about everything happening with the Freedom Convoy, with the Emergency Act, and what's going on and how the Freedom Convoy is spreading. Because we do know that the Freedom Convoy is now spreading across the globe. So I will keep you guys updated. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Molly. I come live every single Monday through Wednesday to bring you guys all the news that's happening across the globe, current events, politics. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have a lot of great shows on ENSL, so go ahead and check out the app. You can download the ENSL TV app on your Android device or your iPhone, and you can also watch us on Roku TV. Have a great day, everyone, and I will see everyone bright and early tomorrow morning. This has been Live with Mel.